I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where Lillian sat, her face a mix of excitement and anxiety. The decision was made. I had rehearsed the speech 100 times in my head, but as I looked up at the apartment window, the weight of it all bore down on me. The 2 large suitcases in the trunk seemed heavier than ever. "Charlie, remember what we talked about," Lillian said softly, reaching over to touch my arm. Her touch was gentle, but it felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on me. "Be quick and come back to me soon." "I will," I replied, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "This won't take long." I climbed the stairs, each step echoing the finality of my decision. Each step felt like a lifetime, every footfall a reminder of the family I was about to shatter. As I reached the top of the stairs, I took a deep breath and opened the door to our apartment. The familiar scent of Elizabeth's lavender perfume filled the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. She was sitting on the couch, reading a book, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her reading glasses perched delicately on her nose. She looked up as I entered, her eyes flicking to the suitcases and then back to my face. There was a moment of silence, heavy and charged. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," I began, setting the suitcases down with a thud. "I'm leaving. For good." She didn't react immediately, just closed her book and set it aside with deliberate calm. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of something. Was it resignation? Or had she known all along? "Is this about her?" she asked quietly, her voice steady, but edged with a sadness that cut through me. "Yes," I admitted. "It's about Lillian." Elizabeth sighed, a sound filled with years of unspoken words and unhealed wounds. "I see. I can't do this anymore, Elizabeth," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I need to be honest with myself. And with you." "Honesty," she repeated, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Is that what this is?" "Yes," I said, more firmly. "I've been lying to both of us for too long." Just then, Luca emerged from his room, his face calm, almost indifferent. He was 17, but in that moment, he seemed older, more knowing. He glanced at the suitcases, then at me. "So, you're really leaving us?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost as if he were asking about the weather. "I'm leaving your mother, not you," I corrected, hoping to convey the depth of my love for him. "You mean everything to me, Luca." He smirked, a bitter edge to it. "That's good to know, Dad. But words are just words." "Luca, this is complicated." I started, but he cut me off. "No, Dad, it's simple," he said, his voice sharper now. "You're leaving us for another woman. That's as simple as it gets." Elizabeth stood up, walking over to the kitchen table, and sat down with a grace that made me question my resolve. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression that was both calm and piercing. "Let's not drag this out, Charlie," she said quietly. "Do what you need to do." I swallowed hard, the reality of my actions sinking in. This wasn't how I had imagined it. I had thought there would be shouting, accusations, maybe even a plea for me to stay. But this calm acceptance was more than I could handle. "I'll just get my things," I muttered, turning towards the bedroom. As I walked away, I heard Luca's voice, softer now. "Mom, are you okay?" "I will be, Luca," she replied. "I will be." In the bedroom, I began packing my clothes into the suitcases, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I could hear the faint murmur of their voices in the kitchen, but I couldn't make out the words. It was better that way. When I returned to the living room, Elizabeth and Luca were standing together, a united front. I felt a pang of jealousy, knowing that I was the outsider now. "Charlie," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, "I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I hope so too." I picked up the suitcases and headed towards the door. As I reached for the handle, Luca's voice stopped me. "Goodbye, Dad," he said. "Remember what we talked about." I turned to look at him, my heart heavy. "Goodbye, Luca. Take care of your mother." With that, I stepped out into the cool evening air, feeling a strange sense of freedom mixed with an overwhelming sense of loss. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. Lillian's car was still there, her silhouette visible through the window. I took one last look at the apartment, then got into the car and drove away, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The apartment felt like a different place when I returned to the living room. The silence was thick, and the atmosphere tense. Elizabeth's composure, so steady moments before, now seemed to crack at the edges. Luca stood by her side, his arms crossed, his eyes piercing through me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I set the suitcases down again, feeling the need to address the growing tension. "Elizabeth, I know this is hard. It's hard for me too." She looked up at me, her eyes cold. "Hard for you, Charlie? You think this is hard for you?" Her voice was low but sharp, each word a dagger. "You're leaving us. You're walking away. And for what? For her." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Yes, for her, but also for me. I haven't been happy for a long time. Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "And you think running off with Lillian will make you happy? How long before you realize that this is just another illusion?" I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. "It's not an illusion, Elizabeth. I love her." "Love?" she scoffed. "You don't even know the meaning of the word." Before I could respond, Luca stepped forward. "Dad, are you leaving forever?" I turned to face him, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "Yes, Luca. This is permanent." "Good," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of anger. "Because if you ever think of coming back, things might not be the same. Christopher Coleman has been visiting more often lately, you know." I frowned, caught off guard by the mention of Christopher. "Christopher Coleman? What does he have to do with this?" Luca's eyes never left mine. "He's been quite interested in Mom. And once you're out of the picture, who knows?" Elizabeth sighed, looking at Luca with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "It's true, Charlie. Christopher has shown interest. But that's not the point." I felt a surge of jealousy and betrayal. "Then what is the point?" I demanded. "The point is, I've known about Lillian for a long time," she said calmly. "Ryan Peterson told me." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Ryan Peterson, my best friend, had betrayed me. "Ryan? Why would he do that?" Elizabeth's gaze was steady. "Because he thought I deserved to know. He believed in honesty, something you've clearly forgotten." I felt my temper rising. How could he do this to me? He's supposed to be my friend. Luca's voice cut through the tension. "Maybe he's a better friend than you realize. Maybe he cares about Mom and me more than you do." I turned to Luca, my frustration boiling over. "You don't understand, Luca. This is complicated." "No, Dad, it's simple," he said, his voice sharp. "You're leaving us for another woman. That's as simple as it gets." Elizabeth stood up, her composure returning. "Charlie, let's not drag this out any longer. Do what you need to do." I swallowed hard, the reality of my actions sinking in. This wasn't how I had imagined it. I had thought there would be shouting, accusations, maybe even a plea for me to stay. But this calm acceptance was more than I could handle. "Fine," I muttered, turning back towards the bedroom to finish packing. As I walked away, I heard Luca's voice, softer now. "Mom, are you okay?" "I will be, Luca," she replied. "I will be." In the bedroom, I finished packing my clothes into the suitcases, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I could hear the faint murmur of their voices in the kitchen, but I couldn't make out the words. It was better that way. When I returned to the living room, Elizabeth and Luca were standing together, a united front. I felt a pang of jealousy, knowing that I was the outsider now. "Charlie," Elizabeth said, her voice steady, "I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I hope so too. I picked up the suitcases and headed towards the door. As I reached for the handle, Luca's voice stopped me. "Goodbye, Dad," he said. "Remember what we talked about." I turned to look at him, my heart heavy. "Goodbye, Luca. Take care of your mother." With that, I stepped out into the cool evening air, feeling a strange sense of freedom mixed with an overwhelming sense of loss. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. Lillian's car was still there, her silhouette visible through the window. I took one last look at the apartment, then got into the car and drove away, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The car ride back to the apartment felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, replaying the confrontation with Elizabeth and Luca over and over. Lillian sat beside me, her hand resting gently on my arm, offering silent support. I was about to sever the last threads of my old life, and the weight of that reality was almost too much to bear. As we pulled up to the building, I took a deep breath. This was it, the final step. I looked at Lillian, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. "I'll be right back," I said, trying to muster a reassuring smile. "I know," she replied softly. "I'll be here waiting." I got out of the car and walked back up the stairs to our apartment. The door seemed heavier this time, as if it knew the gravity of what was about to happen. I stepped inside and found Elizabeth and Luca sitting in the living room, waiting for me. Their expressions were unreadable, a stark contrast to the tumult of emotions churning inside me. "Luca, Elizabeth, I began, but Luca cut me off. "Are you leaving forever, Dad?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of anger. I turned to face him, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "Yes, Luca. This is permanent." "Good," he said, his voice still calm. "Because if you ever think of coming back, things might not be the same. Christopher Coleman has been visiting more often lately, you know." I frowned, caught off guard by the mention of Christopher. "Christopher Coleman. What does he have to do with this?" Luca's eyes never left mine. "He's been quite interested in Mom. And once you're out of the picture, who knows?" Elizabeth sighed, looking at Luca with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "It's true, Charlie. Christopher has shown interest. But that's not the point." I felt a surge of jealousy and betrayal. "Then what is the point?" I demanded. "The point is," Luca interjected, his voice steady and clear, "once you leave, you can't just expect to come back and find everything the same. People move on. Mom will move on." I felt a lump forming in my throat. "What are you trying to say, Luca?" "I'm saying that once you're gone, you need to stay gone. Don't come back expecting us to wait for you," Luca replied, his eyes hardening. "Christopher Coleman, Arthur Davis, Benjamin Lowe, they all have shown interest in Mom, and she deserves to be happy, even if it's not with you." Elizabeth nodded. "Luca's right, Charlie. I deserve a chance to find happiness again. And so do you." I stood there, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on me. The realization that my actions had consequences far beyond my own happiness was hitting me hard. Luca, my son, was telling me to stay away, to let them move on. "Luca, I love you," I said, my voice breaking. "I love both of you." Luca's expression softened slightly. "I know you do, Dad, but love isn't just about what you feel. It's about what you do. And right now, what you're doing is leaving." Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Charlie, if you truly love us, you'll let us move on. You'll let us heal." I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I understand." "Good," Luca said, his voice softer now. "Then go. Be with Lillian. But don't come back expecting things to be the same." I took one last look at my family, the people I had loved and still loved deeply. Then, with a heavy heart, I turned and walked out the door. As I stepped into the cool evening air, I felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with an overwhelming sense of loss. Lillian's car was still there, her silhouette visible through the window. I got into the car and sat down, feeling the weight of my decision settling over me. "Are you okay?" Lillian asked, her voice gentle. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I will be. Let's go." As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The apartment, once a place of warmth and family, was now a symbol of what I had left behind. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. Lillian and I drove into the night, leaving behind a past that could never be reclaimed. The days following my departure were a blur of new beginnings and haunting memories. Lillian and I settled into our new life together, but the specter of my past lingered, casting long shadows over our fresh start. We moved into a cozy apartment downtown, trying to create a semblance of normalcy amid the chaos. One evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Lillian turned to me, her eyes reflecting the twilight sky. "Charlie, you seem distant. Are you regretting your decision?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's not regret, Lillian. It's more about dealing with the aftermath. Leaving Elizabeth and Luca was the hardest thing I've ever done." Lillian reached out, her hand warm on mine. "I know it's tough, but we have to move forward. For us." "I know," I replied, squeezing her hand. "But there's something I need to tell you, something I found out just before I left." Lillian's eyes widened, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. "What is it?" "Elizabeth knew about us long before I told her," I confessed. "Ryan Peterson told her." "Ryan?" Lillian's voice was sharp, incredulous. "Why would he do that?" "He said he thought she deserved to know the truth. That it was his duty as a friend," I explained, feeling the sting of betrayal anew. Lillian shook her head, her grip on my hand tightening. "Charlie, I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was," I admitted, "but it made me realize how much I was hurting everyone involved. Elizabeth, Luca, even you." Lillian looked away, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think Elizabeth will be okay? Will she move on?" "She's strong," I said, nodding. "And Luca mentioned that Christopher Coleman and others have shown interest in her. She'll have options." Lillian sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I hope she finds happiness. Everyone deserves that." As the days turned into weeks, the reality of my new life began to sink in. Lillian and I tried to build a routine, but the past was never far from my thoughts. Then, one afternoon, as I was unpacking some boxes, I found an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, I saw snapshots of our life together. Family vacations, birthdays, simple moments of joy. It was a stark reminder of what I had left behind. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the melancholy that had settled over me. Lillian noticed immediately. "Charlie, what's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I found an old photo album today," I said, my voice heavy with emotion. "It just brought back a lot of memories." Lillian reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "It's okay to miss them. You know, you spent years building a life with them." "I know," I said, squeezing her hand. "It's just hard." As we sat there in silence, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, seeing a message from Luca. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. "Dad, can we talk? There are some things you need to know." "Luca." I showed the message to Lillian, who nodded encouragingly. "You should call him." I stepped out onto the balcony, dialing Luca's number. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Luca, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, there's something you need to know," Luca said, his tone serious. "It's about Ryan." "What about him?" I asked, my heart racing. "Ryan wasn't just telling Mom because he thought it was the right thing to do," Luca began. "He did it because he's in love with her." I was stunned into silence. Ryan, my best friend, in love with Elizabeth. It seemed impossible, yet so much suddenly made sense. "Are you sure?" I finally managed to ask. "Yes, Dad. He's been in love with her for a long time." He told me himself, Luca confirmed. I felt a rush of anger and betrayal. Why didn't he tell me? I think he was scared. And when he saw you with Lillian, he probably thought it was his chance, Luca said, his voice softer now. I took a deep breath, trying to process this new revelation. Thanks for telling me, Luca. I appreciate it. There's more, Dad, Luca continued. Mom's been seeing Christopher Coleman. They're not serious yet, but it's heading that way. I leaned against the balcony railing, the city lights blurring before my eyes. I see. Dad, I just want you to know that we're okay. Mom and I are moving on. I hope you can too, Luca said, his voice filled with a maturity that both comforted and saddened me. I'm glad to hear that, Luca, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And I'm proud of you. Thanks, Dad. Take care of yourself, Luca said before hanging up. I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the weight of the revelations pressing down on me. Lillian came out to join me, wrapping her arms around me. Are you okay? She asked softly. Yeah, I said, nodding slowly. Just a lot to take in. She kissed my cheek, her warmth a balm to my troubled heart. We'll get through this, Charlie. Together. I held her close, feeling a renewed sense of determination. The past was filled with pain and regret, but the future was a blank canvas. It was up to us to paint it with new memories, new happiness. And for the first time since leaving, I felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks following Luca's revelations were a tumultuous mix of emotions. My initial anger and betrayal toward Ryan began to morph into a deeper understanding of the complex web of relationships we had all been tangled in. Lillian and I continued to build our life together, but the shadows of my past actions loomed over us, demanding to be addressed. One rainy evening, I found myself pacing the living room, the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows. Lillian sat on the couch, watching me with concerned eyes. Charlie, you've been restless all day. What's bothering you? She asked, her voice gentle. I stopped and looked at her, feeling the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I can't stop thinking about Ryan, about what Luca said. I need to talk to him. Lillian nodded, her expression serious. I think that's a good idea. You need closure, and so does he. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I had been dreading. I picked up my phone and dialed Ryan's number. He answered on the third ring. Charlie, he said, his voice hesitant. I didn't expect to hear from you. Ryan, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Can you meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Avenue in an hour? There was a pause before he replied. Okay, I'll be there. I hung up the phone and turned to Lillian, who gave me an encouraging nod. You've got this, she said, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. An hour later, I walked into the coffee shop, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries providing a small comfort. Ryan was already there, sitting at a corner table, his face a mask of anxiety. I took a deep breath and approached him. Hey, Ryan, I said, sitting down across from him. Hey, Charlie, he replied, his voice strained. I'm glad you called. I looked at him, the man who had been my best friend for years, now a stranger in so many ways. Luca told me about you and Elizabeth. Ryan's face paled, and he looked down at his hands. I was going to tell you, Charlie. I just didn't know how. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been in love with her? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. A long time. Longer than I'd like to admit. But I never acted on it, Charlie. I swear. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded, the hurt evident in my voice. I didn't want to lose our friendship. And when I saw you with Lillian, I thought maybe it was my chance to be honest with her, he said, his eyes pleading for understanding. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of his words settling over me. You should have told me, Ryan. We could have handled this differently. I know, he said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Charlie. For everything. I looked at him, my anger slowly dissipating. I'm not innocent in this either. I hurt Elizabeth and Luca. I left them for my own happiness, without thinking about the consequences. Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. We've all made mistakes, but what do we do now? I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of clarity. We move forward. We learn from this, and try to be better. For Elizabeth, for Luca, for ourselves. Ryan nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. Agreed. And for what it's worth, I hope you and Lillian find happiness. Thanks, Ryan, I said, returning his smile. I hope you and Elizabeth do too. As we left the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The conversation with Ryan had been difficult, but it was necessary. It was a step toward healing, toward understanding the consequences of our actions and finding a way to move forward. Back at the apartment, Lillian was waiting for me, her eyes filled with concern. How did it go? She asked, her voice soft. It went well, I said, wrapping my arms around her. We talked. We cleared the air. I think we can all start to heal now. Lillian smiled, her eyes shining with relief. I'm glad to hear that. As we stood there, holding each other, I realized that this was a new beginning for both of us. The past would always be a part of us, but it didn't have to define our future. We had the chance to create something beautiful out of the chaos, to build a life filled with love and understanding. A few days later, I received a call from Luca. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness to his tone. Dad, can we meet? There's something I need to discuss with you, he said. Of course, Luca, I replied, feeling a pang of anxiety. Where and when? Tomorrow afternoon at the park. The usual spot, he said. The following day, I arrived at the park early, the familiar surroundings bringing back a flood of memories. Luca arrived a few minutes later, his face a mixture of determination and something else I couldn't quite place. Hey, Dad, he said, sitting down next to me on the bench. Hey, Luca, what's on your mind? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Luca took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About you, Mom, and the way things have changed. I know it's been hard, Luca, but I'm proud of how you've handled it, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Thanks, Dad. But there's something else, he said, his voice growing more serious. I've decided to stay with Mom for now. She needs me, and I want to be there for her. I nodded, my heart aching but understanding his decision. I understand, Luca. You're doing the right thing. And I also want you to know that I'm not angry with you anymore. I was, but I've realized that people make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters, he said, his eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years. I'm so proud of you, Luca, I said, my voice choked with emotion. Thank you for understanding. Luca smiled, a weight seeming to lift off his shoulders. We'll be okay, Dad. All of us. As we sat there, watching the world go by, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The consequences of my actions had been severe, but they had also led to growth, understanding, and a new beginning. We were all on a journey of healing, and while the path was difficult, it was also filled with hope. Life had a way of moving forward, even when it felt like time should stand still. Elizabeth and Luca began to navigate their new normal, and I focused on building a future with Lillian. Yet the undercurrent of our intertwined past continued to shape our present, especially as new suitors entered Elizabeth's life. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Luca. Dad, can we meet for coffee tomorrow? Need to talk. Luca. A pang of worry hit me. I replied quickly, agreeing to meet him at our usual spot. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop early, nervously tapping my fingers on the table. Luca walked in, a thoughtful expression on his face, and joined me. Hey, Dad, he said, sitting down and ordering a coffee. Hey, Luca, what's up? I asked, trying to read his expression. Luca took a deep breath. It's about Mom. She's been seeing someone new. My heart skipped a beat. Who? Christopher Coleman, Luca said, watching my reaction carefully. I nodded slowly. I see. How do you feel about it? Luca shrugged. He's a nice guy, Dad. He treats Mom well, and she's happier. But I thought you should know. I appreciated Luca's honesty and concern. Thanks for telling me, Luca. I want her to be happy. That's the most important thing. Luca smiled, a mixture of relief and approval in his eyes. I'm glad to hear you say that, Dad. It's important for all of us to move on. As we sipped our coffees, Luca filled me in on the details. Christopher had been a friend of the family for years, but recently, his interest in Elizabeth had become more apparent. He had been supportive during the separation, offering a shoulder to lean on and a listening ear. Later that evening, I discussed the news with Lillian as we sat on our balcony watching the sunset. Luca told me that Elizabeth is seeing someone new, I said, my voice reflective. Lillian looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Who is it? Christopher Coleman, I replied. An old friend of ours. Lillian nodded thoughtfully. How do you feel about that? I took a deep breath, contemplating my emotions. It's strange, but I want her to be happy. If Christopher can provide that, then I support it. Lillian reached out, squeezing my hand. You're a good man, Charlie. It's not easy to let go, but it's the right thing to do. As weeks passed, Christopher's presence in Elizabeth's life became more pronounced. I saw him at some of Luca's events and gatherings, always respectful and considerate. It was clear he cared deeply for Elizabeth, and she seemed to glow with a renewed sense of joy. One afternoon, as I was picking Luca up from soccer practice, I saw Christopher standing with Elizabeth. They were laughing, their easy camaraderie evident. As I approached, Christopher extended his hand. Hey, Charlie, he said with a friendly smile. Good to see you. Good to see you too, Christopher, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Elizabeth smiled warmly at me. Hi, Charlie. How's everything with you and Lillian? We're good, thanks, I said, genuinely appreciating her concern. I hear you two have been spending a lot of time together. Christopher nodded, his expression earnest. Elizabeth has been a great support. We've known each other for years, and it feels natural to spend more time together. I looked at them both, feeling a mix of emotions. I'm glad to hear that. Luca mentioned you've been really supportive, Christopher. Thank you for being there for Elizabeth and him. Christopher smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. They're both very important to me. As I drove Luca home, I felt a sense of peace. The world was moving forward, and so were we. It wasn't without its challenges, but it was also filled with possibilities. That evening, Luca and I had a heart-to-heart talk. Dad, I know it's been tough, Luca said, his voice sincere. But I think we're all finding our way. I nodded, feeling a swell of pride for my son. We are, Luca, and I'm so proud of how you've handled everything. Luca smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of you too. As I hugged him, I realized that while the journey had been fraught with difficulties, it had also brought us closer. We had navigated the stormy seas and were finding our way to calmer waters, guided by love, understanding, and a shared commitment to building a better future. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Christopher's relationship with Elizabeth continued to blossom, bringing a new dynamic to our family interactions. One evening, as I sat with Lillian, reflecting on everything, I received a call from Elizabeth. Hey, Charlie, she said, her voice warm. Can we talk? Of course, I replied, curious about the urgency in her tone. We met at a quiet cafe the next day. Elizabeth looked radiant, her eyes filled with a sense of peace I hadn't seen in a long time. I wanted to thank you, Charlie, she began, her voice sincere, for being supportive of Christopher and me. It means a lot. I want you to be happy, Elizabeth, I said, smiling at her. And it looks like Christopher is doing a great job at that. She nodded, her eyes misting slightly. He is, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm also grateful to you for understanding and allowing us all to move forward. We sat there, sipping our drinks in comfortable silence, two people who had shared a life, now finding new paths while still honoring the past. The consequences of our actions had led us to this point, but they had also taught us valuable lessons about love, forgiveness, and the importance of moving forward. As I left the cafe, I felt a sense of closure. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. Elizabeth, Luca, Lillian, and I were all creating new lives, filled with hope and promise. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been worth it, for it had led us to a place of understanding and new beginnings. The summer sun cast a golden hue over the neighborhood as I stood on the porch, reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. The past months had been a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and consequences. Today, however, marked a significant turning point. It was the day I would officially move in with Lillian, leaving behind the house I had shared with Elizabeth and Luca. I glanced at my packed bags, neatly stacked by the door. The sight of them filled me with a mix of excitement and melancholy. The memories within these walls were countless, each corner holding a piece of our family's history. Lillian appeared beside me, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions. "You ready?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with understanding. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I think so. It's just harder than I thought." She placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "It's okay to feel that way, Charlie. This is a big step for all of us." As we stood there, the sound of footsteps drew our attention. Luca emerged from the house, his face a mixture of determination and sadness. He approached us, hands in his pockets. "Dad, can we talk for a minute?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Of course, Luca," I replied, my heart aching at the sight of him. We walked to the backyard, a place where we had spent countless hours playing catch, having barbecues, and sharing stories. Luca stopped by the old oak tree, the one he used to climb when he was younger. "Dad, I know this is what you need to do, and I support you," he began, his eyes meeting mine. "But I wanted to say something before you go." I nodded, bracing myself for his words. "Go ahead, son." Luca took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "You've taught me a lot about life, about making choices and dealing with the consequences. And even though it's been hard, I understand why you made the decisions you did." I felt a lump form in my throat as I listened to my son's wisdom. "Luca, I'm so proud of you. You've handled everything with such maturity." He smiled, though his eyes were misty. "Thanks, Dad. But I want you to know that I'll always be here for you, just like you've been for me. We're still a family, no matter where we live." I pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the surge of pride and love for my son. "I love you, Luca. Always." After a moment, we released each other, and Luca wiped his eyes. "You better get going. Lillian's waiting." We walked back to the porch, where Lillian stood with a soft smile. I turned to Luca one last time. "Take care of your mom, okay?" He nodded. "I will, Dad." Elizabeth stepped out of the house, her expression calm and composed. "Charlie," she said, her voice steady, "thank you for everything, and for being honest about what you needed." I looked at her, feeling a mixture of gratitude and regret. "Thank you, Elizabeth, for your understanding and for raising such an incredible son." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the strength she had shown throughout this journey. "We'll be okay, Charlie. You take care of yourself and Lillian." I nodded, feeling the finality of the moment. "I will." As I picked up my bags, I felt a sense of closure. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Lillian and I walked to the car, the sun setting behind us, casting long shadows on the driveway. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. It was more than just a building. It was a repository of memories, both joyful and painful. But it was time to move forward, to embrace the new life that awaited us. Lillian reached over and took my hand, her touch grounding me. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. "I'm okay. It's hard to leave, but I know it's the right thing." She smiled, her eyes filled with love. "We're going to be okay, Charlie. We'll build our own memories, our own home." I nodded, feeling a sense of hope and possibility. "Yes, we will." The road stretched out before us, a symbol of the journey ahead. It was unknown, but it was also filled with potential. We drove in comfortable silence, each lost in our thoughts, yet connected by the shared future we were creating. As we arrived at our new home, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was where we would build our life together, where we would create new memories and face new challenges. Lillian and I unpacked the car, carrying our belongings into the house. It was a fresh start, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of our shared experiences. Later that night, as we sat on the couch, I felt a sense of contentment. The journey had been difficult, filled with unexpected twists and turns, but it had also led us here, to a place of hope and new beginnings. Lillian leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "Here's to our new life," she said softly. I kissed the top of her head, feeling the deep sense of gratitude. "To our new life," I echoed, knowing that while the past would always be a part of us, the future was ours to shape. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon and the promise of a new day ahead, we embraced the journey, ready to face whatever came our way together.